Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody, to Society and the State. This is episode 142, talking about a very engaging and sometimes controversial topic that I'm actually really excited to kind of unpack. We're joined by Dr. Jessica Flanigan, Associate Professor of Leadership Studies and Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law at the University of Richmond. Jess, first of all, thanks for joining us. And second of all, what does all that mean? You're a professor of a lot of things.
Yes, thanks for having me. You made it through my all of my departmental affiliations. So both of those are different interdisciplinary programs at the school where I teach. So leadership studies is sort of ethics and public affairs, and then philosophy, politics, economics, and law is a program that's focused on those disciplines. So it's pretty interdisciplinary, and that's how my work is too.
That's great. And I think that's reflected kind of, as you say, in your work. I first came across you at a Cato Health Policy Conference where you were speaking about what we're speaking about today, the book that I've since read, very engaging and exciting. The title of it is Pharmaceutical Freedom, Why Patients Have a Right to Self-Medicate. This was published fairly recently, right? Yes. Yeah, it was published about a year ago. So the main thesis, as I understand it, and then I want to turn it over to you to start to unpack this, is that your argument is that patients should have the ability to seek drugs, medications that they want, but there's this kind of this regulatory barrier preventing them from doing so. But to address that, you talk a lot about the right to refuse service and this doctrine of informed consent. Now, when I was talking with some friends about this, they had this idea that informed consent has basically been around forever, but you argue that that's not true. Can you help us understand maybe some of that history of how the doctrine of informed consent is a relatively new phenomenon, all things being considered? Because, as you point out in the book, that really sets the stage for kind of the transformational shift that has happened, and then you argue should continue to happen. Sure.
So, in some ways, when it comes to patients' medical rights, just as people were gaining medical rights in the clinical context in the doctor's office, that was the period of time when we saw patients losing a lot of their medical rights in the marketplace. So in the 19th century, people widely affirmed rights of self-medication. There are all sorts of different providers, druggists, and herbal medicine providers, all sorts of different kinds of treatments for diseases that people could try. And the right of self-medication was seen as an extremely important basic right. But if you did go to a doctor, the doctor would treat people very paternalistically. And by paternalistic, I mean that they would interfere with the patient's medical choices in a clinical context for the good of the patient. That started to change early in the 20th century when a woman named Mary Schlowendorf went to a hospital in New York, and she was having abdominal pain, and she said to her doctor that she would consent to an exam under anesthesia, but that she did not consent to any kind of surgery. But while she was under anesthesia, her physician performed a hysterectomy and took out her uterus, and then she experienced some complications related to that. She sued the hospital, and it was at that point that the courts first affirmed a right against medical battery. So now this would seem monstrous to us that you would go into the doctor's office and the doctor would perform surgery without your consent. Mm-hmm. But there wasn't really legal precedent prohibiting that until about 100 years ago. Over the course of the last century, we've slowly seen patients gain a lot of medical freedom with respect to their choices with the doctors. But even in 1968, which was pretty recently, 90% of oncologists said that they would routinely lie to their patients about a cancer diagnosis in a survey of doctors that were oncologists. And they would cite reasons like, well, information about a diagnosis would be harmful to the patient, or it's easier for everybody if we just substitute in an alternative diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And now we would see this as like a huge problem. So now the doctrine of informed consent says that not only do you have a right against medical battery, but you have a right to choose, make an informed decision for yourself to choose among your medical options. Around that same time, though, the old 19th century right of self-medication fell away. So there were a series of drug disasters in the 20th century. You might have heard of like elixir sulfonamide, where some kids drank things that was basically antifreeze and some children died. or the thalidomide disaster in the 1960s, which really stoked public support for more pharmaceutical regulation. And my argument is, even though those were tragedies related to drugs, pharmaceutical regulation was not the answer because it went in the opposite direction of enforcing or reclaiming patients' rights to make decisions about their health and their bodies.
So you call this medical paternalism, and one of the questions that a listener might have is just how prevalent was this? So you cite this example, this woman had a hysterectomy, but was this kind of a kind of periodic or infrequent thing that, we have a story to share about now, but it wasn't really that widespread? Or does your research indicate that this was, in fact, kind of widespread throughout the medical community to have this kind of paternalistic approach?
It was generally the norm. And so in the book, I talk a little bit about a discussion of the prevailing practices of medicine that was written in the 1970s by someone named Alan Buchanan. And in that kind of analysis of the prevailing practices of medicine in the 70s, he talks about 3 different kinds of justifications for why medical paternalism is justified. One is that patients actually do implicitly consent to be treated paternalistically when they go into the doctor's office. Another one is that patients had an inability to understand what was going to be in their medical interest more generally. And then there was this thought that, physicians didn't have to be complicit in care that they objected to providing. So if a physician thought that they were not making the right choice, they didn't have to be a part of that. But as Buchanan points out, if you think that a patient can't understand something, then you could just tell them. You don't have to make a decision for somebody.
Right.
If they don't understand their options, you could just inform them of their options. And if you think that a person consented to it, then why wouldn't you just ask if they had consented? If you think that they thought they consented to the care at the beginning, why not get their actual consent? Why would you just assume that you had implied consent in some ways? And it's true that physicians shouldn't be compelled to provide care that they don't agree with, but nor should patients be compelled to accept care that they don't agree with.
And you talk about that in the context of risky refusal, right? That even if the doctor is recommending a life-saving medication or surgery or some kind of medical treatment, that under this doctrine of informed consent, that cannot be imposed upon the patient. They, to their own personal detriment and even death, they have this recognized right of refusal to abstain from what a intelligent, highly trained, sometimes caring doctor is recommending be done to save that person's life. So we have this right of a risky refusal, but it's almost like this inverse curve you're talking about, whereas that right has been augmented, the right to what you call risky access has been diminished. In other words, the doctors have now become the gatekeepers in a lot of ways. And I guess one of the questions I had was, I've seen a lot of debate about, right to assisted suicide and things like this. And the focus is always on kind of the moral arguments of, no, we should preserve life and doctors shouldn't be doing this. They shouldn't be required to be involved. But isn't for that specific example, I've always felt, and I think your book hits this square on, that this isn't about whether the doctor should be involved or not in kind of the moral arguments about helping that person end their own life. The real issue is that the patient is being precluded legally from accessing that drug themselves. Is that not right? Would that be your argument as well?
That's exactly right. Yeah, so I'm not necessarily saying that you have a right, that you have free access provided or that it's easy for you to access your drugs of choice. I'm just saying that the government shouldn't enforce laws that interfere with that access. And when it comes to the right to die, we let people refuse treatment in all sorts of cases. So if a person is, in the prime of their life, in their, 20s or 30s, and they have a cancer diagnosis, and they want to refuse life-saving care, that's their right. It would be legally impermissible for oncologists to compel her to go through chemotherapy. But if somebody wanted to end their life, even though that would also plausibly be against their interest, on the grounds that it's against their interest, the government prohibits people from ending their lives. But it allows them to make deadly refusal decisions in a range of cases.
So, can this be seen then that medical paternalism has decreased, or is it just shifted to this new kind of realm, right? Have we kind of diminished it in one aspect, but it's really been augmented in another, and in that kind of net total aggregate, it just continues? Or what are your thoughts on kind of that broader view on medical paternalism?
That is a good way to put about it. It's like a kind of whack-a-mole. Yeah, I feel that as people have asserted more rights in clinical context to their own bodies, they are more accepting of public health paternalism. So in the early 20th century and in the 19th century, public health is what we sometimes call the old public health. So it focused on things like quarantine, sanitation. Later, maybe you might include vaccination in this type of kind of old public health mentality, which is really preventing contagious transmission of harmful illnesses or preventing people from harming each other via exposing them to health hazards. Later in the 20th century, and ever more in the 21st century, like think of like Michael Bloomberg, we've seen the new public health, where public officials will do things like enforce cigarette taxes, ban trans fats. I see pharmaceutical regulation as sort of a piece and kind of the first major widespread effort of the government in terms of the new public health, which isn't about preventing people from harming others via contagious transmission, like quarantine would be, but it's about instead preventing people from harming themselves. And my view is, if you're thinking about whether or not a choice is going to be harmful for a person, who is the expert? Is it a public official, or is it going to be the person who's making that choice? In many cases, I think it's more likely to be the person who's making that choice. So not only is it a violation of rights to enforce these kind of new public health policies, but it's very likely to backfire if the thing you care about is what's good for a person on balance, because people are more likely to know what's good for them than the government is.
Mm-hmm. How does the kind of current regulatory approach stimulate or support black markets? Like, at the end of the day, are people just still accessing the drugs that they desire if they want to assume that risk? And in many cases, those drugs are kind of, laced with other things, or they're dirty, or they're not, screened and things like that. You talk a little bit about this. Help explain how, black markets play into this, where patients who want the right to risky access are still accessing, but with much higher risk.
Right. So we see this a lot when it comes to recreational drugs. So a lot of my argument focuses on therapeutics, but we even saw some black markets when it came to therapeutics. For example, you might have seen the movie Dallas Buyers Club. So like underground markets in AIDS drugs was one example for more straightforwardly drugs that are used for therapeutic purposes. But I think like nowadays we're seeing the line between what we would usually think of as like recreational drugs, where drug prohibition through the DEA and the Department of Justice led to black markets in drugs like marijuana or ketamine or MDMA on the grounds that recreational drug use is bad for people. But because those drugs were black market drugs, because they were scheduled, it also sort of like led to a stigma, and it meant that there wasn't as much research behind it. But it turns out that even those drugs have a lot of uses for treating medical conditions. So I do think prohibition in general makes the use of the drug less safe. People worry like, well, if we had kind of pharmaceutical freedom and we didn't prohibit people from accessing drugs that could be harmful to them, then they would use all of these bad drugs that are laced with fentanyl or something. Mm-hmm. But I think that the reason that these drugs are, part of the reason why these drugs are of inconsistent quality and they're not screened for safety or certified for safety is because they're in the black market. If Coca-Cola was in the business of making these drugs, it would be as standardized as a bottle of Coca-Cola is. But the fact that it's prohibited means that you can't really have any kind of oversight or legal enforcement if something's fraudulently labeled. Mm-hmm. You can't bring a claim. And so that leads to a lot of violence. And it's just, so I think black markets are part of what the problem is here. And part of the reason that this has arisen is because people are very anxious about being more accepting of recreational drug use. But even if you aren't that sympathetic to recreational drug use, just looking at therapeutic users, there's reasons to be in favor of deregulating these drug classes.
So you mentioned the case of Mary and the hysterectomy in a way as kind of the trigger for this increase in medical or decrease in medical paternalism in the clinical context, this increase in informed consent and being able to refuse, or resist medical battery, refuse treatments or recommendations that you disagree with. Looking forward, I mean, how do you see the landscape changing for pharmaceutical freedom? Is there some test case? Is there some scenario? Is there some policy that you think is really going to help shift public opinion to return in a lot of ways to what once was widespread in this pharmaceutical freedom? Have you given thought to kind of what that trigger might be, or are we already seeing a potential trigger today?
I think we're already seeing it. So one thing I'm very interested in is this idea of patient-driven drug development. So part of the reason that the old model of pharmaceutical regulation was more widely supported was because we had a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to medical treatment more generally. And we had informational costs, so like gathering information about how different drugs affected different kinds of patients. Patients were less able to communicate with each other. And so a one-size-fits-all approach to drug regulation sort of matched the nature of the drugs that were being developed in the 20th century. But now we have much more personalized medicine. Patients are taking a lot more control over their own health through things like Apple Health Kit, online communities like Patients Like Me. And this is enabling people to see that there's a lot of variance in whether or not a medical choice is good for one person or another. And I think that that recognition of the variance between how different choices might make more sense for different kinds of patients, combined with the rise of personalized medicine, which is really just custom treatments that are made, like bespoke cancer treatments that are made for patients. Those new technologies are going to really challenge the regulatory framework. Also, patients are able to organize and advocate for themselves more because of things like social media. So you might remember the Josh Hardy case, where the parents of Josh Hardy petitioned for him to have access to an investigational drug. The Right to Try movement is more generally kind of growing out of this new patient advocacy. So I think that a combination of like new technology and kind of more personalized medicine, plus patients being more empowered because of social networks and the internet, and health kits, which give them more information about their health, like wearables and stuff. I think that's going to sort of put some pressure on the old regulatory model, I hope. So I'm optimistic about the future of self-medication. I think there's some small steps that we can take in the near term, like changing scope of practice laws so that pharmacists can prescribe more things, which are moves in the direction of pharmaceutical freedom. And I also think if you're looking at places like Colorado or who are, legalizing marijuana and also looking at psilocybin legalization, the recreational drug front is also becoming much more liberalized.
Yeah, that was my next question, kind of as a segue from everything you're talking about. It seems to me that kind of this medical marijuana national conversation we're having right now in so many states, like 33 or something like that now, has kind of increased this awareness of the problem, where you have kind of these archaic regulatory models that don't make sense. People laugh at the federal government's claim that cannabis has no accepted medical benefit. It plays into this stereotyping of the status quo that, well, they don't know what's best for me. I've seen people with my condition receive medical benefit from this, so I'm going to go use it. And of course, to the earlier conversation about the black market, many are pursuing these remedies in a criminal context. But more and more, we're seeing the states trying to create these regimes to say, notwithstanding the FDA, notwithstanding the DEA, we're going to go ahead and do this. So you touched on it ever so briefly, but do you see more broadly that the medical marijuana movement has kind of created this conversation in which pharmaceutical freedom might have more attention? Absolutely.
And one of the things that I argue for in the book is, yes, passing like legal reforms for medical marijuana, that's wonderful. But I also think that there's like a real strong moral case to be made for those people who do break the law and help facilitate access to patients, using medical marijuana in states that don't allow it. I think even if people aren't thinking of it as a form of civil disobedience, it is a form of civil disobedience because you're helping a person evade the harmful effects of an unjust law. And so because these are unjust laws, it's not immoral to disobey an unjust law in a way that could potentially really benefit somebody who's suffering.
You can't hear it right now, but a bunch of our listeners are applauding you when you say that. So, final thing I wanted to ask you about, you talk about this concept of learned helplessness, that when patients put so much trust in this kind of regulatory regime, they lose the capacity, the ability to make informed personal choices. How does the kind of status quo play into that, and how would pharmaceutical freedom help address it?
Well, imagine that when you took out a mortgage or made a really big financial decision, there was really only one interest rate that you could accept, and there was only one down payment that you could buy a house with, and there was one standardized set of forms, and you couldn't negotiate for any of the parts of the agreement when you were buying your home. If that was the structure of how we allowed people to make really big, potentially damaging, life-changing decisions like buying a house, and you didn't have much autonomy for how you would negotiate the terms, you probably wouldn't look into it too much. Like, you probably wouldn't look up what an APR was. You probably wouldn't think too much about reading the contract, because it wouldn't be worth it for you to invest the time to educate yourself about this. I think that's sort of what happens when it comes to pharmaceutical regulations with patients, which is if you don't have many choices, if your options are limited by which types of therapeutics your doctor will give you a permission slip for, and then you will sort of offload to the doctor and kind of defer to them rather than educating yourself or looking into it and taking your health in your own hands. And there's some evidence that's the case. So in the 1970s, as more middle-income European countries were starting to enforce prescription requirements, the places that did enforce prescription requirements had higher rates of accidental poisoning than the places that didn't. And the reason is because people would defer to their doctors, and they ended up making more risky self-medication decisions when they were using a prescription, because they would just think like, oh, well, this must be safe, so my doctor said it, so I'll use it. When we look at birth control, if you give people a survey of whether they think that they're a good candidate for birth control, they're actually more risk averse when it comes to deciding, if they think they're deciding for themselves, than their doctors would be. Doctors are going to be more risk acceptant with their patients when it comes to prescribing birth control. So I think that people sort of offload and they don't think about the risks and benefits for themselves or how they value the risk and benefit, because it's not worth it for them to look into this complicated stuff if they know that they're going to have to go to their doctor no matter what and get a prescription and a permission slip for whatever they're going to choose. But if patients had the authority to make these choices themselves, then they would have an incentive to educate themselves, take more responsibility and control over their health. And that's why it's a mistake to look at people's levels of medical literacy today and say, oh, that's a reason that we shouldn't have rights of self-medication, because people have low medical literacy. Because they only have low medical literacy when it comes to drugs and their treatment options, because their choices, they don't actually have full control over what choices to make.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating stuff. Dr. Jessica Flanigan is professor at University of Richmond. She's the author of a book I strongly recommend reading. Very fascinating. The title is Pharmaceutical Freedom: Why Patients Have a Right to Self-Medicate. We will link to that on the show notes page for today, societyandthestate.com/142. Jess, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was good talking to you.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.